Some of the most dangerous ideas in history don't start with hate. They start with a desire for progress. So what happens when the scientific mission to improve humanity goes horribly, horribly wrong? Well, this story, it doesn't begin in some dusty history book. It starts with a very recent and very painful apology.
These words were spoken just a couple of years ago. They were meant to close a long, dark chapter and maybe start a real conversation. But who were these words for? And what exactly was the crime that took decades to apologize for?
Okay, so picture this. It's 2022 in Greenland. The Prime Minister of Denmark is standing in front of a group of elderly Inuit women. For these women, this moment, this apology, was something they had been waiting their entire lives to hear.
So what was it all about? Well, it turns out that from the 1960s all the way into the 1990s, Danish authorities ran a campaign targeting thousands of Inuit women and girls. Some were just teenagers. They were forcibly fitted with contraceptive devices, all to achieve one blunt goal: population control. One woman apparently had the device inside her for 38 years without even knowing what to do about it. So how could a modern, democratic country do something like this? To get that answer, we actually have to rewind the clock.
Yeah, we're going all the way back to the 19th century, because the twisted logic that led to what happened in Greenland didn't just appear out of nowhere. It actually grew out of a scientific theory, one that promised to perfect the human race.
And that idea was called eugenics. The name itself comes from Greek. It means well-born. I mean, on the surface, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? The thinking was simple. If we can breed better horses or better crops, why can't we breed better humans? It was sold as this really rational, scientific way to fix all of society's problems.
And the guy who came up with the term was Sir Francis Galton. Now, he wasn't some fringe character. He was a very respected British scientist, and get this, he was Charles Darwin's cousin. He basically took Darwin's revolutionary ideas about evolution and applied them directly to people, arguing that good traits like intelligence were hereditary and we should, encourage them.
So this idea basically split into two paths. You had positive eugenics, which was all about encouraging the so-called fittest, the educated, the wealthy, to have more kids. But it was the other path, negative eugenics, that led us down this incredibly dark road. This was all about stopping the unfit from having children, and right there, that's where a scientific theory turns into a weapon.
Now, you might think that since the idea was born in Britain, that's where it really took off. But you'd be wrong. It found its most fertile ground right across the Atlantic. In the early 20th century, the United States became the world leader in turning eugenics theory into actual government policy.
And listen, this was not a fringe movement. It had incredibly powerful backers. A biologist named Charles Davenport created this whole research center, the Eugenics Record Office, just to track the family trees of defective people. And the money? It came from the biggest names around. The Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, even John Harvey Kellogg. Yeah, the cereal guy. They were all terrified that immigrants were watering down America's gene pool.
Then you have this guy, Harry Laughlin. He was the one who gave them the legal weapon they needed. He wasn't just doing research, he was an activist, and he drafted something called a model law that became the literal blueprint for states all over the country to legally sterilize their own citizens completely against their will.
So who exactly was considered unfit? Just look at this list. The categories were so broad and so steeped in prejudice, it's horrifying. We're not just talking about severe mental illness. It included people with epilepsy, people who are blind or deaf. It even included the poor. Basically, if you were considered a burden on the state, you could be a target.
And the result of all this, 64,000, just let that number sink in. Over 64,000 people in the United States were legally and forcibly sterilized. They were robbed of the basic human right to have a family, all in the name of improving the population.
And behind that huge number are thousands of individual tragedies. People like Andrea Garcia. She was a 19-year-old Latina woman in California. She scored low on a culturally biased IQ test, was labeled feeble-minded, and was scheduled to be sterilized. In California at the time, Latina women were nearly 60% more likely to be sterilized than other women. This wasn't just science, this was state-sponsored racism, plain and simple. But this wasn't just an American problem. This toxic idea had gone global. And the US model? Well, It became a powerful, chilling inspiration for other countries who wanted to cleanse their own populations too.
And we're not just talking about authoritarian regimes here. Democracies like Sweden, Norway, and Canada all passed their own sterilization laws. They often targeted ethnic minorities like the Roma people or people with mental illness. And just look at the dates. These policies kept going for decades after World War II. Japan's law was on the books until 1996.
In Scandinavia, they often called it race hygiene. You had figures like John Alfred Mjøen in Norway, who was completely obsessed with protecting the purity of the so-called Nordic race from mixing with what he called inferior groups. I mean, the language was openly and explicitly racist.
And this, of course, brings us to the movement's most horrifying conclusion. Because when the Nazis rose to power in Germany in 1933, they didn't have to invent the logic for their racial policies from scratch. They just had to look at what the rest of the world was already doing, especially in America.
This timeline is absolutely chilling. Just over 10 years after Harry Laughlin published his model sterilization law in the US, the Nazis used it as a direct blueprint for their own law. The first step was forced sterilization. The next logical step, for them, was murder.
And that program was called Action T4. It started secretly with the killing of disabled babies, but it quickly grew to the murder of over 200,000 disabled kids and adults. And here's the crucial, terrifying point. This is where the Nazis perfected the machinery of mass murder. The paperwork, the personnel, the technology, like the organized gassing facilities.
Let's be absolutely clear about this. The Holocaust did not start with the Jewish people. It started with the disabled. The T4 program was the dress rehearsal. The very same doctors and nurses who learned how to murder patients in hospitals went on to become the commandants and guards of the death camps.
Now, after the world saw the unbelievable horrors of the Nazi regime, you'd think that would be the end of eugenics, right? That the world would have just completely abandoned it. But it didn't. The idea and the practices, they just went underground.
Sure, the word eugenics became toxic. No one wanted to be associated with it. But the sterilizations didn't stop. Like we saw, they continued in places like the US and Sweden, and, as that apology showed us, in Greenland, well into the 1970s and even beyond. The supporters just found new ways to talk about it, a practice called crypto-eugenics. They'd push for the same goals, but hide them in things like birth control programs aimed at poor and minority communities.
And that really brings us full circle, back to today. The story that runs from Greenland to Nazi Germany is this terrifying reminder of how an idea, born from a desire for perfection, can become the justification for the worst crimes we can imagine. It forces us to ask a really tough question. The brutal methods of the 20th century might be gone, but has that underlying desire to control and improve the human population, has that ever really disappeared?